So in this video, I'm going to talk you through writing a market failure essay. So you can use this format for a lot of the essays. It won't work for all of them, but it will work for a lot of the essays. So it'll work for a tax essay, a subsidy, regulation. Maximum minimum price will be slightly different, but it's going to be a very similar format for maximum or minimum price. So this is the essay. Evaluate the use of government intervention to correct the market failure in education. Now, this essay came with a passage to read. The passage gave you, there's a couple of important things in the passage that were relevant for the essay. One of those was that education has a PED of minus 0.5, and the other piece of information was that lower income households had fewer people going to university for the same grades as higher income households. So you've got this inequality in the number of people that go to university from lower income households. So those pieces of information are useful when writing this essay. Now, because the question says the use of government intervention, that means you can choose which bit of government intervention you want to write about. So I'm just going to outline very quickly the sections of the essay and then look at each one in a little bit more detail. So obviously we start with the key terms, explain the market failure using a diagram. So that would be the market failure diagram where you've got your private costs and your social costs. Explain a method of government intervention which might be suitable, ensuring you link back to how the market failure is corrected. So that's another diagram. You could possibly recycle the diagram from the part 2, but you could use another diagram. It's probably simpler to use another diagram. Then you say why the policy might not work. So why will it not be successful at correcting the market failure? Now, depending upon how much detail you've gone into, you may want to talk about another policy, but you may find that you've done enough for the policy that you pick as your first policy. The important thing to remember is that quality is more important than quantity. So you're better off doing a lot of detail on one policy than rushing through 2 policies. Now, because the question just says evaluate the use of government intervention, it doesn't say, it's not expecting you to do 2. If the question had said, are subsidies the best method, then you would want to be comparing subsidies to another policy. And then at the end, you want a judgment or an overall conclusion, which might involve it depends on. So you might say, well, a subsidy is effective, but it depends on. Sometimes you might say it would be more effective if combined with another policy, and then you'd state what that other policy is. So key terms. Education is a merit good. Why is education a merit good? Well, it's a merit good because it's got positive externalities associated with it. What are those positive externalities? So if people are better educated, they're going to get better jobs and they're going to be paying more in tax in the future. But if you have people that are better educated, for example, engineers or people in IT, they're going to come up with new inventions, which is going to be better for society because we're all going to benefit from those new innovations. Define market failure. So that's where the free market fails to effectively allocate resources. Right, so we're going to explain the market failure using a diagram. So I've done the first part of the diagram. So the consumer only takes into account the private costs and benefits. So we've got our private cost curve and our private benefit curve. So the consumer is going to consume at P1, Q1. However, if they were to take into account external benefits, then what we'd be doing is we'd be drawing a new curve on here, and that would be our marginal social benefit curve. If they were to take into account the external benefits, then they would be consuming at P2, Q2. Right, so they ought to be consuming at Q2. So the optimal, we call it the optimal, or the social optimal allocation of resources is at Q2. So that's the ideal. That's where we ideally want to be consuming at. So we've got underconsumption of Q1 minus Q2. So this bit here is underconsumption, and you might want to label that underconsumption. And that underconsumption is the market failure. So the government intervention should be designed to get you to Q2. So a subsidy is probably the obvious policy to talk about in this case. So a subsidy is going to shift the supply curve to the right from S1 to S2. And you need to say why the curve shifts, and the curve shifts to the right because the cost of production falls. You then go on to say what's going to happen to price. So don't say price goes from or price shifts. You're going to say price falls. It's important that you use that word fall. Falls from P1 to P2. And moving the price, or the price falling from P1 to P2, makes the education more affordable for consumers. That in turn means you're going to get an increase in quantity from Q1 to Q2. Again, make sure you put increase in there and make sure you make use of all these things on your diagram. So you do have to write about all these things on your diagram. So what's happened is our quantity has increased to Q2, and if you remember on the previous diagram, our goal was to increase quantity, and that is what we have done. We've increased quantity, which means that we have corrected the market failure of overconsumption because quantity has increased. Sorry, market failure of underconsumption because quantity has increased. So then we go on to look at the problems with the subsidy. Now, if you remember at the beginning, I said that the PED for education was minus 0.5. That means the PED is inelastic. So I've drawn an inelastic demand curve. And what you can see from that inelastic demand curve is that the quantity doesn't increase by a particularly large amount. You've got a big reduction in price, but the quantity doesn't change by very much, which means that it's not going to be particularly effective at increasing quantity. Yes, it will increase quantity, but it will not increase quantity by very much. So more of the problems, what you can see here is I've drawn the market failure diagram again, because we're going to use that in this next explanation. So it's difficult to get the correct size of the subsidy. Now, if we look at this diagram, which is our original diagram, the positive externality from education is this bit here in red. So we need to be able to correctly estimate the size of the positive externality. And if we correctly estimate the size of the positive externality, then we will correctly be able to figure out where Q2 is, whether it's where I've drawn it here, whether it's a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. So in order to know how much subsidy to use, then we've got to know exactly where Q2 is. And it's very difficult to estimate the size of the positive externality. How do you place a monetary value on better inventions, better medical care, better machinery? How do you place a monetary value on that? It's very difficult to do that, and you would discuss those problems. Similarly, if your essay was about pollution, you might talk about how do you place a monetary value on the fact that people are breathing in harmful pollution. And it's very difficult to do that, and that's something that you would discuss as part of your essay. So why is it difficult to estimate the external benefits? Or in some essays it might be the external costs. So if the subsidy is too small, you're only going to get partial correction of the market failure. So if it's too small, you're not going to shift the supply to the right by enough, and you're not going to correct the market failure fully. You might get to maybe there instead of Q2. Similarly, if the subsidy is too large and you're getting to further to the right, then you've kind of overcorrected and you're wasting government's resources, and the government could have used those resources for something else. Now, if we use this diagram, the reason why I've drawn this diagram is not just to show you the positive externality, but to show you how we could put the two diagrams together. So our marginal private benefit curve is our demand curve. That is what people take into account when they're deciding how much to consume. Our marginal social cost curve is our supply curve. So our equilibrium, as we said before, is where I've just done that little blob. The subsidy shifts the supply curve to the right, and what we need to do is we need to shift the supply curve to the right so that we get to Q2. So that would mean we need to shift it, oops, not quite gone through the right place, but nearly, we need to shift it here so that we go through Q2, so that our new quantity is Q2. So we've got to get the exact size of the subsidy so that we find ourselves at Q2, which is the social optimal. And getting that exactly right is the difficult thing. And we could, for completeness, put on our price. So that would be the price. So we've got this issue with estimating a positive externality correctly and then giving the correct size of the subsidy so that it takes us exactly to Q2, which is quite... And finally, we want to finish off with a judgment or an overall conclusion. That is where you need to add something new. So don't repeat something that you've already said. You need to bring something new to the conclusion. So for this particular question, I would be thinking about using something that was in the passage, and that was that lower income households have fewer people going to university than higher income households for the same grades. So what you're trying to do is to get more people from lower income households to go to university. So the subsidy, if you give that to the university, which is what we've talked about in our answer, that is going to benefit everybody. So you might get more higher income households going to university, you might get more lower income households going to university, you're going to benefit everybody. So you might, in your conclusion, think that it's a good idea to say, why not give the money directly to the students and just to those students that need it? Because what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to narrow the gap between the lower and the higher income households in terms of those that go to university. So if you give if everybody benefits from the subsidy, then that's not it's not shrinking the gap between lower and high income households. Whereas if you give the subsidy only to those that need it, only to the lower income households, that is then going to persuade more of the lower income households to go to university. So we've said subsidy would be better if given to those that need it rather than directly to the university. So you could give this in the form of, like it used to be a grant, where students were given money from the government, and that money was means tested. So those on lower incomes would get a bigger grant, those on higher incomes might get nothing. So giving it directly to the student would help solve the problem that is identified in the passage of not enough students from lower income households going to university.